Welcome to the BAFA Accounting History Special Interest Group 10th Virtual Workshop on Tuesday, 14th February 2023. It's 9 o'clock, so we will get started on time, which is good. Certainly not normal for me to start on time, so this is excellent. We've got three presentations today, as you all know. Julia is going to talk first about the digital sources. And then we've got Maureen's going to talk about English monastic archives database, and Martin Quinn is we're going to play Martin's video, which is very interesting on accounting history in the digital age. So, Julia, are you ready to start?
Yes. So thank you very much for this opportunity to, if you want, present what is, from my point of view, a bit of reflections regarding the use of digital sources in accounting history, and if you want, history in general as well. This presentation is a sort of, if you want, mix between two works, one that I've done and one that I'm still in the making. So the first one, and Karen is here, so I have, and Christopher is here, so I have to acknowledge that. So it's a recent work, a recent paper that has been recently accepted in Accounting History journal, and it's all about the innovations that are possible in accounting history. So there's a part about digital sources, and a second part is some analysis I've been doing to have an idea what is the usage of digital sources in, the actual usage of digital sources in accounting history publications. So the idea is to, first have a sort of idea what are the opportunities as well as the threats of using all these digital sources that are increasingly available around the world to do historical and accounting historical research. Then I will show you what has been happening in the last couple of years on accounting history, in Accounting History, the journal, in terms of usage of digital sources. There will be some interesting points there. And then a bit of a reflection and conclusion about, what I presented. So in general, just looking at history and historical research, there is the possibility to now access more and diverse sources that are all, that are digitized or digitalized. The idea is that some sources have been digitalized, which means that they were hard copies in archives and has been, if you want, transformed into images that can be read online or downloaded. But also there are new sources that are born digital. So new sources to, do historical research that can be blogs, emails, in all this form of, if you want, text and communication that has born digital. So definitely this can be an advantage also for accounting history, especially if we consider that the new accounting history has not been based only on the study of ledgers or just bookkeeping, but if you want, the archival material that has been used in accounting history has been expanded beyond simple ledgers and bookkeeping. And however, we still need the archives. And now we can access the archives in a very different way if you want. So again, as I say, the consideration of opportunity and threats come from a co-author paper with Caroline Corderi, Delfina Gomez, myself, Karen McBride, and Christopher Napier about the potential innovation in accounting history. And, this is a part regarding especially the use of digital sources. So regarding the opportunities, so let's look at the good news. The idea is that digital archives and digital material offer more sources in terms of, quantity. So we can access different archives, and basically we can access the archives globally now without traveling. There is a big array now of archives and libraries that can be accessed, entire books that have been digitalized. So we can actually download this material. Plus, we can access multi-language sources as well. Accessing these sources is often inexpensive or very cheap. Usually, our institution pay for that, or sometimes, or many of the archives are accessible for free. Finally, there are large series of data as well. So it's not about, like the quantity in terms of, material, how many, like books and images are available, but now we can access data in terms of time series data, and that opens up to the possibility also to do, if you want, statistical analysis and the development of, if you want, the construction of databases with data and so on. So more sources, but also diverse sources. Diverse sources in terms of different type of possible digital sources that we can use. We said accounting history goes beyond bookkeeping and ledgers. And now with digital archives, we can access images, audio recordings, even videos, of course, more recent modern history, of course, but we can also access what is material that is born digital already, like blogs, online fora, and even emails. We have been using emails for 20 years, and, like keeping track of emails can help to reconstruct, like specific situation and things like that. I think there are works about probably Enron and the scandal, reconstructed by the exchange of emails, something like that. So we can, of course, having new and different sources means developing new methodologies for analyzing these materials. So we might need to use ethnography if we access blogs and online fora. We might need to use visual methods when it comes to images and analyzing images and videos. And also, of course, content and thematic analysis when it comes to specific text, like the analysis of emails as well, or discourse analysis. And of course, having access to more material may open up to new research questions and new topics that have been under investigated in accounting history. So we might have access to periods that have been under investigated because of the difficult access to material. We can have more international comparisons because we access different archives in different places of the world. And we are a very multinational community, and this can foster, if you want, more international collaboration with, if you want, a contribution of the local archives that, the single author can read and understand. And of course, another interesting part that is, if you want, the ex post situation after the publication or after the historical research, is that digital means and digital tools can help also to disseminate even more our research and our results of historical research. So regarding the diverse sources, I put here some examples of, you can, if you are, out of curiosity, you can have a look at what is offered online. And there are, like, these four are probably the, if you want, the more emblematic example of, how many sources are available there. So archive.org has 625 billion web pages, 7 million videos, 14 million audios, of course, different times, but it's interesting to see that. We have Europeana that has material back to the 11th century. We have the Digital Public Library of America with 46 million sources. And then we have for example, that was one I found one day was the Archivio Apostolico Vaticano. So it's the Vatican archive with material dating back to the 16th century. And, like you can, do some research. It's a sort of research engine. So you can find you can use keywords to get some documents regarding different topics and so on. Very interesting. Of course, having this sort of big, and open archives that have, not only the archival part, but they have a sort of also dissemination activity, if you want, that can help to disseminate research. Of course, in the majority of these archives, there is a mix of types of resources. So sometimes it's a bit complicated, but at the same time, when you have, you can mix up the resources you're using, not just text, but also video and images. And finally, of course, you need to consider the application, the implementation of new methodologies when analyzing all these. For your interest only, and I'm happy to share also the presentation, I've provided you with a list. Of course, this is not exhaustive. There are so many. But even if you just put on Google Scholar, online archives, there are pages where, a lot of archives, online archives are listed. There are so many different ones. And, for example, that is I find it very interesting, considering also the culture. The first one you find is the Arabian Gulf Digital Archives. So this is opening, a completely new context that definitely has been under investigated in accounting history. And of course you have access to this that probably, sometimes is very vast material. So it takes time to find the right one. But, you have this variety that can bring you into context that hasn't been investigated yet. So, I'm happy again to, give or share this slide or all the slides for you. So you have, you can just out of curiosity have a look what is there. So of course, after all the good news, there are also bad news, because of course it's all good and beautiful that we have so many sources, that we have so many opportunities, but at the same time there are threats. First, they are many or too many. So sometimes you are flooded with all these data and archives and text and images. How can you choose? How can you make sure that you have found everything that is available, but at the same time, how can you choose among all that is offered to you? So sometimes it's very confusing, and it's definitely, time consuming. The problem of the originality of the documents. You need, there can be, counterfeit of the documents. They can be changed in the digitalization process, or they might be cut out. So some documents might not be complete. So, and at the same time, there are always copyright issues that you definitely need to consider. So, it's a sort of delicate matter. And, the originality of an archival hard copy, definitely is, it's already there, right? But the problem of the digitalized material is definitely that one, that you need to make sure that is original. So you might go back to the archive, the real archive, anyway. And so all these threats must be considered not only by, the authors, the historians, but they must be considered as well by the editors and publishers, because, of course, these sources are the foundation of the research that they publish. And so they need to make sure that no copyright issues have been broken, and then what is provided is original. So we've seen all the opportunities. We've seen many of the threats. There might be even more. I want to stay positive if you want. But what I want to show you is these little analyses that I've done about, what has been going on in Accounting History, the journal, in the past 2 years, in 2020 and 2021. So I analyzed 8 issues. One was special. Of course, I didn't consider the editorial. I only considered the, if you want, original research article. So I analyzed a total of 49 articles. This is just a sort of starting point. But what I found is that out of a total of 238, I found out a total of 238 digital sources that have been used by these 49 articles. And in total, basically 39 out of 49 articles, so basically 80% of the articles make reference or cite a digital resource. So these are a few, if you want, stats that I put together, of course, with my great statistical capability. They're very simple to understand. Okay, so it's just to understand what would have been the sources, the digital sources that has been used per year, per issue, and what is their position in the article. So as you can say, there has been a big increase in 2021. I think that this is not surprising at all. Big increases. We moved from 114 to 124, but the idea is that these 2 years have been, the 2020 is actually the COVID year, but 2020, if you want, these are papers that have been submitted in 2018, 2019. So when COVID wasn't even there. So there has been a sort of increasing of the usage of these sort of digital sources without the effect of COVID. 2021 is definitely a bit affected by COVID. And we will see in 2022, I'm collecting the data for that now, and see what has been the difference. Definitely 2022 represents the year of the first consequences of COVID. In terms of sources per issues, we see that generally, we have a sort of different distribution of sources. And of course, 2021 is the one with more sources per issues, sorry. And as you can say, usually the more, the concentration of the digital sources are in general references. So sometimes there is that distinction between primary and secondary, but generally in the references is where the majority of digital sources are indicated. But also, as you can see, and that means archival resource, that primary sources has been retrieved from, digital archives, especially in 2021. Okay, so this is just so you have an idea. So I've put together the top 5 papers for number of digital sources for 2020 and 2021. So in 2020, you can see that the first 5 papers, they have, the first one has up to 33 sources, then we have 24. So in particular, like, for example, here is the Big Four auditing firms by Herman. And this one, the topic has basically brought the author to look for a lot of digitized or, already born digital material. And then we go down with 24, 11, and then we have 9 sources for Widens and Cohen. In 2021, this paper by Lambert is very interesting. It has 46 sources. And what is interesting is that he basically used and he accessed the pages of many companies around the world in order to understand what is, like the corporate governance structures, the corporate governance, if you want, declaration and accountability about corporate governance of this company. And he only accessed the company's website. Same is for number 2, where, like, this is a quite recent, if you want, problem of fraud in New Zealand, and a lot of material that has been collected by the New Zealand government is collected and digitized. And so the authors basically assessed all these through, internet, nothing more. There is even mine, if you want, not many sources. But the funny thing was that for example, I had to review this paper in full COVID lockdown, and the only way to access more material was to look around, and go to the Australian National Library, the Melbourne, the State Library in Melbourne, and so on, that luckily have a lot of digitized material. So very quickly, this is, like the distribution, if you want, per year. And so these are the first 5 that I showed. And then if you see, basically, almost every paper at least has 1 or 2 digital sources that are cited. Same for 2021, where we have the Lambert's paper basically driving the use, the number of sources that have been used. What are the types of these sources? As you can see, it's not just a few things, but it's so many types of sources. What is interesting is that we have a lot of reports from, governmental reports, and, reports that can be accessed on the internet. We have a lot of magazine articles as well. So pages that have been, have been downloaded regarding magazine articles. There are archives, not usually specified, so it's a bit too general when it comes to that. And what is funny, I think, is that if you look at the very end, only 1 or 2 annual reports, digital annual reports, have been used. So the information, and that confirms how accounting history is actually moving towards a different approach and use of sources, not just fixed in ledgers and bookkeeping. Is that there's only 1 annual report that has been used from the digital sources that have been used. Accessibility of sources, that is an interesting point. So what I've tried is that for every digital source for which a link has to be provided, when trying to access the source, what happened is that the 31% of the links that were provided, they were not accessible. So basically what happens is that their page has been closed, maybe the link is incorrect, or simply, that particular document has been, eliminated from that website. So the website is still there, but the document is not there anymore. And that opens to a big problem when it comes to, if you want, the reliability of the sources that have been used in historical research, and the possibility, to replicate the research and the analysis as it should be done in our work. So very quickly, some insights, and so something that I found. So the link, the digital sources, is always provided. The problem is that not always is working. It's working or accessible. There's a different level of detail when this digital source is cited or referenced. So sometimes there is only the reference to the archive, and it's like, how can I find your documents when there are millions of documents in that archive? So that what is the document you found? There is a different format in references. So usually there's always the accessed on with the date, but the format is always changing because the sources are so different that it's not easy to cite or reference. And the date of access is sometimes missing as well, again, because of this absence of standardization. So looking forward, some ideas and suggestions for the future. We all expect the rise of the use of digital sources. There might be more longitudinal data to be used, and of course the introduction of sources that are born digital, so the use of emails or blogs to do some historical research. Of course, that brings to new methodologies, new research questions, of course, But this can open to the study of new forms of accounting and especially accountability, if you think of email, blogs, and so on. And also new insight from what are silenced sources. So, for example, like we can understand using blogs or online forum, we can understand what is the opinion of the crowd differently from, like a single person. The other thing is, I think there is the need to to change the approach to citing and references and considering what are the problematic of the accessibility, not only now, because it was only, 2 years ago, 2020 and 2021, and the 31% of sources were not accessible already. Think about what will happen in 10 years, in 20 years. And that is not what happens for, the hard copy of the archive. So there might be a need for editors and publishers in the area of history to, reflect on how to standardize the way, these sources are referenced and cited, and also consider the possibility to find ways to prove the originality of the document or to find an alternative way to access the document if the website is not accessible anymore. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say. These are just few points of things that I've already highlighted during the presentation. And of course, the things are, regarding the limiting and reducing the threats of using the digital, and of course, exploiting all the opportunities and the good opportunities that these digital sources are offering to us. So that's me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julia. Yeah, I think we should do that. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Interesting.
Has anyone got any questions they'd like to ask? Richard?
Just a comment. I can't remember who said it to me. A historian who'd been looking at some materials. There is actually a danger of over-modernization. Sometimes libraries or other archives, they've got the original materials going back maybe hundreds of years, and so they decide to digitize them. So first of all, they photocopy them, and then they put them through whatever magic they use. But the danger is, of course, with lots of old books, that you can't open them flat without destroying them. And a lot of the interesting stuff is in the middle, down the column that's running down the spine. So they get them digitized, but you can't read the crucial bit. And then, of course, some new librarian comes in who's got to be remembered for the changes he makes or she makes. And they say, well, why don't we throw away all the originals now? It's all digitized. We don't need them anymore. And there is a danger of actually losing important material because the copies that have been made just don't have it anymore. Just a comment.
Thank you, Richard. I think you're absolutely right that this is the risk. And in fact, that was one of the points that our reviewer in the paper about innovation was, raising to us, that basically the problem is that, the digitized copies that are done of these ancient books are incomplete. Mm-hmm. And so you may, even misunderstand what is written and what you can find in the digitized copy. From that point of view, though, it's good that these are the copies from, the real book, the real document. So you can always prove the originality if you want, and you can always go back to the archive. The problem comes when some of the historical research, even if it's very, if you want, based on very modern periods and very recent periods, are based on documentation that is published only maybe online or even web pages and websites, because in 10 years, maybe those websites, they will disappear and there is no hard copy of that. So I think that's, the problem of, if you want digitalization of old books and missing the bit can always be solved going back to the archive. But that is not the same with, if you want born digital sources.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. But I was just pointing out some historians are finding there's a danger now that the original is thrown away. Why do we want 150 miles of stacks full of old books? It's all been digitized.
I hope that is not the final aim of, digitalization and, digitizing all the real sources. But
universities don't think you need a bookshelf anymore. Why do you need a bookshelf? It's all available online.
Yeah, there was something that I read last week that someone was writing in one of the newspapers that digital is all very well, but it does decay over time. And I don't know how true that is, but if it is true, then it is a high risk if we just accept a digital copy as the only copy you need. So I agree with both of you. Karen?
That is a really interesting point. I have in my office sets of army accounts back to 18 something, which I was given by a museum curator when he retired, because it's been digitized. And so I've rescued it, but no one's going to know I've got it. And I'm trying to keep it. But the other issue, I guess, and more the point I was going to make, was that digital resources need maintaining, and they need somebody to be caring for them and making them accessible. And funding tends to be given to digitize things, but it's not necessarily given for retaining those sources and making them accessible ongoing into the future. So I guess that is an issue as well, in terms of funding these things. I really loved your presentation, Julia, and I loved your way of splitting the data in different ways. I wonder.
Yeah, that is a very, very simple way of analysis. Yes. I'm trying to, improve it.
And I wondered if you'd thought of looking at the time periods that are being used as well, because I just wonder if there would be more use of digital sources for more recent time periods.
Yeah, like I'm curious about 2022. I have collected some data, but I haven't analyzed those yet. So yes, I need to have a look closer. I was surprised about 2020 because, this is, 2020 are the publications that have been submitted at least from 2018. So, there's already a shift in the use of digital sources, even before, the impediments and the problematics created by COVID.
I didn't quite mean that. I meant the time period, the historical time periods within the articles.
Okay.
So something going back to the 1500s might not make as much use of digital as something that is only going back to 2015.
I absolutely agree. Like, my point of observation was more about the type of digital sources rather than the article and the content for now. Is more that side. But of course, it is interesting, and thank you for that suggestion, to look at, the period under investigation and the number of sources that have been used.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Alistair, you've got a question.
Hi, Julia. Thank you very much for your paper. That was really interesting. It's not so much of a question; it's just an observation, and really just confirming what Karen and Richard have been saying. That you know, there is this huge danger if we do, as Karen just so illustrated, get rid of the originals. There are so many things that we can check from the originals that we can't see on screen. I'm thinking going back to medieval material when, you know, you might need ultraviolet light to read a document. There might be one document written on top of another. Even with later documents, you know, if you've got the document yourself, you can look at the paper, you can look at the ink. There's a lot of extra information which you sometimes use in digitizations. And I suppose my big concern, as you were saying, in terms of the fact that something's only published online, it might only last for 20 years. But it's also much easier to manipulate, isn't it? I mean, it would be very easy to go back and rewrite a lot of history because what's in the original document doesn't really suit somebody's agenda now. So it was just to echo some of the warnings that other people have made.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you for your comments. I think that, you know, like the problematic, if you think, is more on like that was my, you know, my thinking now while you were talking. Like a variation book, yes, can be manipulated if you want or changed, but it's difficult because of the handwriting. I think that the period that is more at risk of that is when, you know, like we started to typewrite, because that is easier, I think, to be changed and things, especially if you think that the correction used to be made at that time when typewriting, and it's easy to do the same thing. I think with the handwriting, the bigger risk is losing stuff, losing the last line of the book, losing sometimes the notes that are on the side. Because in a lot of bookkeeping and in a lot of ledgers, there were a lot of notes on the side. And that is completely lost if you know, like you have that usual shape, the A4, A2, A5, and that's what you can, you know, upload.
Yeah, and they used the whole page. They didn't stop an inch from the edge. They just kept writing. Right, Shraddha, you've got a question or a comment?
Yeah, just echoing some of the things that have already been raised in terms of what is lost with digitization, but also maybe some concerns over the digitization process itself. It may, you know, there may be someone. So, okay, so if everyone digitizes everything, that's fine, I suppose. But sometimes there is someone there looking at the data and deciding what should be digitized and what isn't, and perhaps what they think is worth keeping and what isn't. And if there are, you know, and if that person, who probably won't be an accounting historian, you know, there may be an element of things that are deemed unimportant, which actually, you know, is then just completely lost. So you not only are you losing that original feel and touch, etc., but you're also having some partial information which you're then unable to go back and check. So I think we kind of need some more assurances around who's doing what and how the digitization is occurring, rather than just accepting that if it's digitized, it's all there, and it you know, we can, you know, this is our data set.
Thank you for your comments. I completely agree that, you know, like the digitization happens usually through an archivist and someone that is expert in, you know, moving everything to digital. But if you think, you know, like that you want to digitize a book that is, you know, like partially with some ledgers and, you know, bookkeeping, but there's also text, which historians are you calling for help? So an accounting historian might have only a partial view when the digitalization process happens. So that's why they keep, like the archivist, who should be, like the one keeping up the standards and checking that everything is digitized properly, and then the digital expert. But again, there is a subjective problem, because it's the same problem when you go really to the real archive and you have to ask for help to the archivist that sometimes does not speak your language of accounting historian. And so you might miss something and everything. So it's probably a different perspective, but it's still the problematic of accessing archive from the perspective of an accounting historian rather than an historian, or rather than an economic historian or something like that.
Okay, I need to stop this one, Richard. I'm just going to say a couple of things. I was looking at a microfiche of a 15th century index to a ledger last week, and I can't read it. The quality of the digital is terrible. And in the terms of the 31% of sources not available, I do a lot of work on the internet and searching on the internet, and it's definitely less available now long term than there used to be. You used to be able to find things for 20 years after they were first there, and it's getting more difficult now. So I think what you pointed out there, Julia, about the 31% is something that needs to be thought about.
Yeah.
Inaccurate sources listed at the end of an article is no use, and neither is just pointing us to whole archives. It's as bad as pointing us to whole books. It's unhelpful, and I think it's a thing that editors need to deal with as much as anything else. And it's time they woke up and realized it's different. Very quick.
Yes, very quickly, especially because if you provide a link of that particular source, that could be a newspaper article from the past. If the link doesn't work, still you have the reference of the newspaper, the date, and the article. Mm-hmm. And so if you wanted, you can get the original one. But if there is a general reference and then the link is not working, there's a problem there. You're not providing the right source.
I just point to everyone to the chat. Well, Leslie's put some really interesting stuff in there. Maureen, are you ready to do your presentation?
Among the many tragic consequences of Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries from 1536 to 1540 was the dispersal, and in some cases destruction, of the rich documentary archives in their possession. Renowned particularly for their record-keeping, the monks of England's monastic houses built up large archives over the centuries of their existence. These documented not only their internal life, but also the acquisition and administration of their landed estates, creating in the process valuable sources of information about their lands and tenantry. When one considers that as a whole, these monasteries owned roughly a quarter of the kingdom's land, the potential of these records for research into medieval social and economic history comes sharply into focus. They can also inform us on topics as diverse as diet, literacy, natural history, local and national politics, artistic patronage, education, women's studies, and the history of record keeping itself. Their wide dispersal and sheer quantity, however, have posed obstacles to any researchers aspiring to discover their whereabouts and navigate their way through them. The solution envisaged by the English Monastic Archives Project was to reconstruct the surviving archives digitally in a relational database. The database was to be organized firstly by monastic house and secondly by type of record source, and it would be made freely available to all on the World Wide Web. The project was the brainchild of Dr. Nigel Ramsay, formerly a cataloger of the Cotton manuscripts at the British Library. Back in 1999, he convinced David Davray, professor of medieval history at UCL, to make an application to the Arts and Humanities Research Board, as it was then, as principal investigator, to fund 2 archival researchers, Dr. Ramsey and myself. After a 5-year grant had been awarded, the project began at UCL under the joint aegis of the History Department and the School of Library and Information Studies. The database was designed by the History Department's dedicated technology expert, Simon Renton, using the Microsoft Access database software FileMaker Pro. Although I did the initial data inputting myself, we later employed a succession of part-time inputters, mostly David Davre's postgraduate students. Simon created 3 linked templates for inputting the database, for inputting and displaying the information that Nigel and I were to collect about each of England's roughly 700 monastic houses. These templates were made up of a combination of mandatory fields of basic information to be selected from drop-down menus and free text fields to accommodate descriptive information. The descriptive fields were to be searchable by keyword. Nigel and I divided the research work between us on a county-by-county basis, each tackling the regions of the country with which we were most familiar. In the first template, we recorded general information about the house in the mandatory fields. Its name, I hope everybody can see that. Its name, the religious order and gender to which its inhabitants belonged, for example, Benedictine monks, Cistercian nuns, etc., the county in which it was located, and the dates of its foundation and dissolution. 2 free text fields were also created, one for a brief history of the house, to include the founder's name and the house's annual income at its dissolution, and another for a general synopsis of the post-dissolution fate of its archives. I should say that most of the synopses are much briefer than my example from St. Albans Abbey would suggest. It's a massive house, the 4th largest house, and its archives were widely dispersed. The second template dealt exclusively with the monastic house's estates. Given that the vast majority of the surviving archival records would relate to their lands, we needed to know what the principal estates of each house had been, so that we could trace the records through their post-dissolution ownership. It was thus necessary to compile lists of them, organized into 4 categories: manors, churches, chapels, and urban property. We used the Victoria County History volumes as our starting point, but also consulted a wide variety of printed primary sources. The second template was designed to record the following information for each property. You can go to the next slide. The monastery which owned it, the name and type of property, the parish in which it was located, the beginning and ending dates of the monastery's tenure, and source references. When we visited the various archives and libraries around England to search for archival records, we would do so armed with alphabetical lists of each house's properties. So valuable were these lists that the List and Index Society at the National Archives published them for us in 3 volumes in 2007 as English Monastic Estates, 1066 to 1540. The publication process was simple. Simon Renton directly downloaded the lists from the second template into a Word file, together with an automatically generated alphabetical index. The list that I displayed here in the last slide is in fact a sample page from these volumes. The third template of the database was designed for the archival record. For each archival document or group of documents, such as a run of manorial court rolls or a cache of charters, the researcher would record the name of the monastic house, the genre of the archival document, the date of its creation, and the centuries which it covered, the name of the archival repository or library where it was located, and very importantly, its reference code or shelf mark. Most of this information was selected by the data inputter from drop-down menus, but there were also free text fields to accommodate detailed descriptions of the document, information about its provenance, copies or transcripts made of it, printed editions of the text, and/or discussions of the same in secondary literature. We printed out blank copies of this third template for Nigel and I to fill in by hand at the archives and libraries where we worked, and later submitted them to our database inputters. We had to decide how to categorize the archival documents early in the project, as displayed in this list. The document types that relate to landed estates are in bold. They make up the vast majority of archival entries for two reasons. Firstly, because the acquisition and administration of the house's estates generated the most documentation, and secondly, because they were more likely to have survived, since they were valued by subsequent owners of these estates. The numbers written next to the genres in my list indicate the total number of archival entries in the database now of each. Before commenting further on the archival entries, I should make clear some general parameters. We did not collect information about documents predating the Norman Conquest, most of which are in print. We also excluded service books and other liturgical, theological, and devotional texts, since these fell within the remit of the ongoing monastic library catalogs project. I should also stress that our concern was only with archival records created by the monasteries themselves, and not those compiled by royal officials after the dissolution, with a few exceptions. We did include the deeds of surrender by which monks formally granted to Henry VIII their house and all its estates, since they gave not only definitive dates of dissolution, but had also been signed by the head of house and every member of the convent. Surviving lists made by royal officials of the monks who were to receive post-dissolution pensions were also included. Turning now to the list of archival document types, you will see that I have broken it into broad groupings. Firstly, charters. They were the earliest form of record and account for more than a third of all archival entries. A large house would have possessed thousands. Even the small Benedictine priory of Luffield in Buckinghamshire, for example, endowed with only 6 manors and 3 churches, had over 700 charters in its archive. We know this because they came en masse to Westminster Abbey in a muniment chest when the house was dissolved prematurely in 1504, and they are still there. Cartularies, in the form of both rolls and codices, preserved copies of charters in a more secure and accessible form. Registers and letter books tended to be of later date and more miscellaneous in content than cartularies, as my example from Nottingham University Library demonstrates. The second grouping relates broadly to the administration of the house's landed estates, probably the types of record of most interest to accounting historians. According to the obidentiary system that operated in large Benedictine houses, the heads of house, i.e. the abbot, prior, or the bursar, the chief financial officer, as well as the monastic officers or obidentiaries who headed the different departments, namely the refectorer, infirmarer, precentor, feretrar, etc., were each assigned portions of the house's estates to support their office. The accounts which they were expected to render annually for their receipts and expenses have much to tell us about both monastic life and the exploitation of individual lordships within the whole estate. We categorize these as central accounts. In the late 14th century, when monastic estates ceased to be exploited directly by monastic landlords, and were instead let to lay farmers, the obedentiary system began to fall into decline. Manorial estates such as bailiffs, reeves, and rent collectors, who were increasingly laymen, drew up not only manorial accounts, but also surveys, extents, terriers, valors, customals, and rentals. Of particular interest are customals. They detailed the customary work services owed by the tenantry to their monastic lord, as well as the tenant's rights and responsibilities. Also prized by social and economic historians are manorial court rolls and books. These record tenants' private litigation, leases granted by lords to their tenants, and land transactions between customary tenants. Historians use them to analyze the peasant land market and measure debt. Because they recorded customary rights, both customals and court rolls were of continuing relevance to post-dissolution landlords and tended to survive in greater numbers, either in originals or copies, than other manorial records. Other categories of archival documents shine light on the internal life of the monasteries, whose members were meant to spend their lives in prayer and contemplation. The house's rules governing elections, its disciplinary code, religious observances, and liturgical practices, as well as the duties and revenue assigned to each obedentiary, are commonly set out in general or liturgical customs. We have grouped them together with ordinances, injunctions, and statutes made for the house, which also dealt with the conduct of monks and nuns, and were most often issued after episcopal visitations. Perhaps the most unusual of the surviving general customs is the table of signs used by the nuns of Sion Abbey to communicate during the hours of silence. This is now in the Guildhall Library in London. The archival documents recorded in the memoria genres of the next grouping were created in association with the duty of monks and nuns to pray for and commemorate the dead. And the final grouping of historical writing was related to the same monastic penchant for memorialization. Although monastic chroniclers often narrated national and international events, we excluded these general chronicles as lying outside the scope of our project, and noted only chronicles that described events in the history of the particular monastery itself or the lives of its abbot, prior, founders, or benefactors. I have thus described the aims of our project and the database created to achieve them. By this point, you may have guessed that this was an ambitious plan for two researchers funded for only 5 years. Then you would be right. The first problem was a miscalculation in the time that it would take to compile the lists of monastic properties. Whereas we estimated 3 or 4 months, it in fact took 2 years. Luckily, we were able to procure some additional funding to extend the project. Through a grant made by the Mark Fitch Fund, we were able to pay the costs involved in publishing the English Monastic Estates volumes, and the British Academy funded an additional year for further work in tracing the archival documents. Because by then we had realized that we would have to scale back our coverage. Our list of properties does include the estates of all roughly 700 houses, and we had recorded all of the extant surrenders before we came to this decision. Thereafter, however, we limited our search for archival documents only to monastic houses that followed the Benedictine rule. That is, Benedictines, Cluniacs, Cistercians, Fontevraud nuns, Carthusians, and the late medieval orders of Bonhomme and Brigittines. Houses that followed the Augustinian rule, that is, Augustinians, Premonstratensians, and Gilbertines, were excluded. When I left the project in 2006 for employment elsewhere, there still remained much to be done. Nigel continued to work part-time on it, though, and completed many more archival entries assisted on a voluntary basis by Anne Hignell, the last of our database inputters. Soon after that, however, disaster struck when UCL decided to switch from Microsoft to a Unix-based system, a system which could not support our FileMaker Pro software. For a couple of years, the database was housed on a commercial server at the expense of a generous former collaborator. At length, the UCL library agreed to take it over. They worked hard to make it work within their website of UCL Digital Collections, but in the words of David Davray, the softwares were not an elegant fit. At present, it remains housed on the UCL library website, but as a mere shadow of itself. Only the third part, the reconstruction of monastic archives, can be displayed, and some functionality has been lost. One can browse through the archival entries by monastic house, county, order, genre of our archival document, and repository of archival document, but no searches are possible. There are also problems with the visual display. Unhelpful technical coding information dominates the screen. Nevertheless, while it can be a laborious process to browse through so many entries, those who are familiar with the database and its contents will eventually be able to find what they are looking for. We are proud, nevertheless, to have completed as much as we have, and believe steadfastly in the value of the information gathered there and the necessity of its preservation. The work was systematically approached and diligently carried out. The overall total stands currently at 4,462 archival entries. Most of the documents were found in the main repositories of monastic documents, the National Archives at Kew and the British Library in London. Both Nigel and I also traveled to several county record offices, local borough archives, university libraries, Oxford and Cambridge colleges, and private archives. We found documents in 210 different repositories, some of them being unexpected surprises. Not all documents were seen in person. Oh, go to the next slide. Were seen in person. For far-flung items, we obviously relied on manuscript catalogs and archival hand lists, such as the charters in Kansas listed on the screen. At present, however, we have reason to be hopeful about the database's future. In recent years, a copy of it was downloaded into Excel, and in 2019, after a long hiatus, Anne Hignell returned to UCL to input new entries and correct old ones that Nigel had continued to work on. She added hundreds of archival entries to this version, bringing the total to over 5,000. Nigel managed to interest British History Online, based at the Institute of Historical Research in London, in rebuilding the database from the Excel version and housing it on their website. In 2020, he secured a grant from the Mark Fitch Fund to pay for the costs of the remedial work. The plan is to restore all three parts of the original database with the addition of the new entries and of attached bibliographies for each monastic house. These have been prepared in the original project, but they had never been attached to the database. Although the pandemic has delayed work, it is now about to get underway in earnest, and we look forward to its completion. Once it is mounted on British History Online website, we hope and expect its future availability to be secure. Thank you.
Very interesting.
It's a tale of woe.
It's a fascinating tale, that one. I really love the sort of the depression and then the relief when Excel arrived.
Well, it hasn't happened yet, so we'll see.
Okay. Right. Anyone got a question or a comment to make? Richard's quiet for once.
Oh,
goodness.
I'm just thinking. It's a fascinating story. And I can see that if the estates went to new owners, and the new owners, as you say, would be interested, especially in maybe the financial and legal aspects. But why wasn't the Crown interested in keeping the records, as it were? Okay, they got rid of the monasteries, but that was for religious and political reasons more generally. But as the Crown, were they not interested to know the sources of revenue and potential taxation opportunities that would now accrue from having taken the monasteries out of the religious domain and into the temporal domain?
Well, I think the problem was that the documents were legally belonged to the owner of the land. They were part of the transaction. That when they handed over the lands, they also handed over the documents.
Yeah,
that's the problem there. But of course, the National Archives is the largest repository of the monastic archives, and they've just subsumed them into their collections. I did quite a lot of work on that. I've written an article about the archives in the National Archives, the monastic archives, and there are about 50 houses, I'd say, whose archives survived there fairly well in quite a lot of them. But I mean, in some of those cases, it's lands that the Crown took back. We know took those lands back for one reason or another. Zion Abbey was a huge house that was founded very late in the day, and it had a big endowment, and its records they're all in the National Archives, really, pretty much all of them. And I think they stayed there because those lands stayed in Crown hands. The Crown liked those lands. They're over like near where the National Archives is today. They're in Brentford and around that area. So I think that's why they kept them. Other records came back into Crown hands through lawsuits or forfeitures of people. I mean, some of Cromwell's documents, for instance, were ex-monastic documents that came into the archive, and they're now in the archive. And then sometimes there are people who there was a Duchess of Norfolk in the 19th century who was her family had a lot of monastic lands, and she was declared a lunatic in the 19th century, and all of her documents were given to Chancery masters, and they never gave them back. So they're still in the archives. So, I mean, that's the long answer to your question.
Thank you.
Christopher?
Just a couple of observations. The first one is a rather ironic one, given the previous presentation by Julia. But when I just tried to access the database, I found that one of the links doesn't work, and it turns out there's a typing error in it. I was able to get into the database by another route, but it sort of just seemed strange, given Julia's earlier comments about problems with links. The other thing again is just a sort of observation. I live in Winchester, and of course the Winchester pipe rolls are a very, very important source of historical evidence. And I was very impressed that the cathedral has upgraded its internal exhibitions for tourists. And one of the things they've done is they've used the manorial accounts as a way in which visitors can interactively engage and find out the various parts of the country where the cathedral, or the priory as it then was, the Benedictine priory, owned manors, and the various different products that came from those manors into the priory in Winchester. So you can see how important the priory was in the economy of southern England in the Middle Ages. And I thought that was a very creative use of what are basically underlying accounting records to allow people to engage in the culture of the time.
Yes. Yeah, those records are now in the Hampshire Record Office. If they have, and you can only look at them on microfilm. They don't let you look at the originals, but they are huge, great things, full of information.
Anyone else got any comments? Richard, you're back again, and Karen, you next after Richard.
You can't shut me up. Just a point of information that people may be interested in. A friend of mine in Aberystwyth, I helped her to get a grant from the Institute of Chartered Accountants to produce a volume of Edward I's, the Hammer of the Scots, Edward I's accounts for building the Iron Ring of castles in Wales in about 1270, including Aberystwyth Castle, of course, which would have cost about 55 million, I think, in today's money. And so hopefully that'll be available in a year or two. She's had the grant. She's done all the work on the actual documents. And the current grant is to get an indexer, an expert indexer, to provide the index to all the documents about the different castles. So that might be an interesting project for somebody to look at first. So,
not for me, I'm afraid. I've already edited building accounts. It took 10 years, but it's over 1,500 pages long with facing page translation. And doing the index took an entire year. So
I bet.
It's not for me, that one.
Karen?
I was only going to reflect on what we were saying before about how there's some wonderful, wonderful work out there. And this sounds an amazing project that's being constructed in a really clear way and should work, but ongoing, it needs somebody to be responsible for it that is able to be responsible for it and make it accessible to people in an ongoing way, because otherwise, exactly, it was really interesting, Maureen, to hear you tell the story of how it's slightly been lost just because of being able to maintain it and being able to make it accessible. So it was really interesting to hear that from an inside point of view.
Well, I mean, I hope it's heartening that we are still pursuing, you know, even though it started in the last century, we're still trying to get it done and secure for the future. And having done all that work, it's a shame if it's lost, right? But they don't, the point that was made earlier, they don't grant funds for maintaining these things. Nobody wants to do that.
No, exactly. And interestingly, I have a PhD student that's working in this very area. So again, you've got young people coming up that want to access those documents, those records. And yes, as you say, there's no funding for actually maintaining it. It falls on a voluntary people stepping up to ensure that the things still remain, the database still remains accessible. So
Yeah.
Really interesting. Thank you, Maureen.
Well, I hope that British History Online are going to continue to make it freely available and not put it in their pay for content once this happens. But I think that's the place for it. I think British History Online. I mean, and maybe more projects like that. They should get a sideline going in getting digital resources like that than in just downloading printed books, which is what they've been doing. I don't know. Do people use that, British History Online?
Yeah, I've used it.
Yeah.
But you're right, they focus on the books. I think it's all sort of demonstrates the problem. We think of digitalization as the answer to difficulties of getting the originals, but they're only the answer if people A, make them available, and B, make sure they're still what they were. It's got to be looked after and curated, just like books. One day people.
Yeah. Well, and you have to preserve the originals as well, don't you? You have to have both.
Ideally, yeah. Anyway, I think at that point, Maureen, thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Thank you for listening.
It's our pleasure.
While you've got a minute, Alan,
Uh-huh.
can I just mention it might interest anyone who's interested in China or in double entry bookkeeping, then there's a very, very good article just out in Business History Review about a 19th century Chinese firm and its accounts, and exploring how far one can say they had the essentials of double entry bookkeeping. So it's really well done. It's by Matt Lowenstein, who is postdoc at Stanford, and Professor Cao Shuji, who's at Shanghai Jiao Tong University. So that's in the latest edition of Business History Review. Really, really good paper.
Thanks for that, Richard. I noticed it this morning too. I was going to read it, so now I know I should read it. Just to call everyone's attention, there's a lot of interesting things in the chat. And just to mention before, unless I forget, that the next meetings of the next virtual workshops on March the 14th, Karen just put a message into the chat on that. Right, at this point, we're going to start the third presentation. And this is a recorded one because Martin unfortunately could not be here today, so he had to send us a recording. And obviously when it finishes, I'll come back online. So this is it.
Okay, hello everybody. I hope you can hear and see this okay. I'm actually recording it in advance. I can't attend the session because I am teaching at the same time. I'm happy to present this little short presentation here on a paper which has been ongoing. It's under review. Some of you may have seen this presentation in an earlier format, and it's a couple with accounting history in a digital age. And basically, we're trying to relate some of our empirical experiences and maybe how digitalization can help us to open up maybe some new research avenues. So I hope you find it interesting. It's more method-based and more, practical, I hope. So just an outline of what we're going to talk about is here. I'm not maybe going to dwell on that, but just we're going to give you some empirical experiences based on research I've done at Guinness and a book chapter we prepared on Magdalen Laundry, myself and my colleague Breed Murphy from DCU. So I guess to start, what's the relevance or objective of the paper? As I said, it's under review, and we've got some really good review comments and some others that we still have to deal with. So digitalization, I guess, is part of our lives, and it's automated to improve many, many things. Be it, there's an app for that to, anything we do in our work lives can be digitalized to some extent. But in the research field, to me, it offers opportunities to enhance research, and that includes accounting history research, in my view. So the goal of this paper is to give some guidance on conducting accounting research digitally. Okay, and I think it's really, really, really important to distinguish two words. And we found this. You can see a reference there to Knudsen. These terms have been thrown around without being understood, perhaps. Digitalization versus digitization. Let's start with the former. Digitization is the technical process of converting analog signals into a digital form. So, accounting history records have, for example, been converted from a paper document into a digital form, such as a PDF, for many, many years, or a photograph, from paper to some kind of digital photograph. And that's been happening. Digitalization is using digital technologies in a broader individual and societal context. So, we can talk about digitalization of a business or a process, So, for example, income tax could be totally digitalized nowadays as a sole trader, at least in the Republic of Ireland, where I'm from, because there's nothing in paper. And it can also help us to, change the way we do business. So it's very important to distinguish those things: digitalization versus digitization. Records have been digitized for probably as long as there's been a digital camera, which is probably more than 20 years ago now, or a scanner, perhaps. So very important to note those definitions up front. For accounting history, accounting history, the literature shows us a lot of topics in there. I personally think there's little provided sometimes on the actual methods used. And on a paper I done with Gary Spracknell back in 2018, which was a review of the 3 leading accounting history journals, I was actually surprised that less than 50% of the papers actually use archival sources. It was surprising to me. Instead they were looking at texts or previous papers. And they just went, oh, that's interesting. We're not going out there. I was younger, perhaps, in the accounting history field, and I was a bit, shall we say, confused as to why this might be. And so, moving on. What does digitalization mean for accounting historians? Well, there's a lot of contemporary accounting research out there on digitalization, for example, in the context of the work of auditors and accountants. So, how is big data or whatever affecting audit and so on? But I think there's a lot less in the realm of accounting history. So to me, building on Knutson's definition of digitalization, for the accounting historian, it's much broader than just digital access to archival material. That's digitization. Okay? And in the general management accounting literature, Bamani suggested that with digital technologies, we may be able to find answers to questions that we didn't even know we had. I'm not saying that will necessarily be the case always for accounting history, but we may be able to apply digitalization processes and find out things in a different way or a more efficient way to what we've been able to do previously. So I'm not going to dwell on this slide too much, but these are some of the criticisms perhaps of accounting history research, which is coming from the Zinovich. Scholasticism, sophism, limited methodologies, limited data sets, and a lack of consideration of broader evidence, limited interdisciplinary research or comparability studies. And the question I have at the bottom is, can digitalized accounting history research help this? Maybe. So what I'm going to do is give you some empirical examples. And this is not me just publicizing my own work and a better way of putting it. It's really sincerely trying to show you what you can do or what can be done. So Guinness, we all know, I hope, what Guinness is. It's a brewing company. It's been around since 1759. Their archives are well catalogued, quite extensive, rich data sources from many, many disciplines. Back in 2011, I went in there for the very first time, and I now know that the research published by myself and colleagues on Guinness extends to more than 250 pages because one of the Guinness family collected it and bound it for me, which was a lovely privilege to get as a Christmas present in 2021. Yeah, and I thought, wow. So some of this research has been digitalized in terms of the processes. So the initial projects, I'm referring to digitization. Okay? So some limited data have been digitized in the archives. So for example, the annual reports dating from 1886, basically they were scanned in. Yeah? Other data was not digitized. So if I was to do something around those annual reports, I needed to digitize them myself because number one, that helped me to work off-site. But more importantly, it allowed me to more easily cross-check data. I ended up with 3 early publications from that. You can see them there. 1 in management accounting research and 2 in accounting history review. Okay, so those were based on digitized accounting history records from the Guinness. Then subsequent projects use a much more digitalized process. So not only were we, have digitized records, we were having a lot more. So the annual reports are a high quality PDF. They're fully searchable. Not all PDFs are, but these were. And as they were in a digitized format, we were able to use any software to basically find, search, do what we wanted to. And myself and Alonso Moreno and Mike Jones worked on a paper using the chairman's statement, it was, I think, of the annual report, using this LIWC software. And again, you know, it's not possible to use that software unless you have the data in a digital form. Okay? So the paper was about impression management. I don't want to spend too much time talking about it, but you know, we had converted a PDF that we had from the archive into a text format, loaded that into the software, used the predefined dictionaries, and we focused on particular words and word stems to get textual characteristics. And then there was a regression. Variables such as profit, risk, size, changes in the chairperson, and so on. And we were trying to determine if any of those variables may have related to the textual characteristics. And I suppose this is one of the longest data sets ever looked at in terms of impression management from 1948 to 1996. So, you know, it's probably not that easy to find data, to work with data over such a long period using a manual process. So that really, the fact that it was digital allowed us to do this, allows us to use this stuff. Okay? It's not just that the annual reports are digitized, they've been digitized since 2010. Okay, which is 13 years ago now. The fact that we could get all this technology together and the process became digital. That's how we can come up with these things. And you know, the end result of the paper was this limited evidence of impression management in the chairman's statement of Guinness during that period of time. Okay, so you can read the full paper yourselves if you wish. It's in Triple AJ. And then similarly, using again the same data set, but also extending it a little bit we don't mention it here, but we extended it into the Agio period, so after 1996. Again, exploring the relationship between reporting quality through the chairman's statement, readability thereof, and this thing called social emotional wealth, which is a concept from the family business literature. And Guinness being a family company during this time, the board was controlled by family members. So we're starting to get a little bit interdisciplinary between accounting and family history. So similar data set, we had to do some manual coding, and then once we coded those particular paragraphs, we extracted the text for analysis, and we built another regression model and used this BOG index, which is a readability index, which is based around the SEC's guidelines. And you know, the results indicate that family identity dimension of SEW is related to financial reporting readability. And we know that because if we include the data after 1996, the readability declines when this ceased being a family control firm. So again, can we do this in a manual way? No. Can we do it if the same type of research, if it's just digitized? No. We need multiple things together to make a more digital process. So the first couple of examples in Guinness were digitized records, and then we get into the digitalized, whereby we can basically have all the process electronic. And I know content analysis has been done before to some limited extent in accounting history, but not in this way. One of my co-authors here, Alonso Moreno, had done some content analysis prior, and even his literature shows, you know, the limited presence of content analysis in accounting history literature. Okay, so what about the second example? This one is I probably need to do some explaining. So in the Republic of Ireland, in Northern Ireland too, and in some parts of the United Kingdom as well, I think, there's this, you know, commercial laundries, which are usually run by religious orders. And you know, the left is a picture of some mainly women working in these laundries, and it's become a very hot topic in terms of controversial happenings in those laundries over the years. mold, they're all gone. And it's one of these things that the Irish state has had to reckon with in more recent years. So, some background. They operated from the 18th to the late 20th centuries. And I don't know, it's not a very polite term, but it's a term that's been used to describe the women who worked in these laundries. Fallen women. They were basically women who were ostracized from society in Ireland, usually because they had a child outside wedlock. And the child and the woman were taken into the laundry, and the child usually ended up being adopted, possibly illegally. That's part of the controversy. And these women had to work unpaid in these laundries. They were commercial laundries. They served customers in their locality, both commercial and domestic customers, so households, but also very, very well-known businesses. They were typically under the remit of the one order, eventually, the Religious Sisters Charity. And in 2013, there was an interdepartmental committee report known as the McAleese Report, as its chairman, to establish the facts of state involvement. And a huge report, many, many issues. But one element of it suggested that these laundries operated on a subsistence or close to break-even basis. Okay? And so this is part of an interdisciplinary research project, which has ended up in a published book. Don't have a book copy at hand to show you, but it is being published. It's called A Dublin Laundry. A Dublin Magdalen Laundry, sorry. And in Donnybrook is an affluent Dublin suburb. This laundry served the who's who in terms of business and commercial sector in Dublin. The IDC report I referred to a moment ago suggested the records did not survive, but they did. They were donated to the university archives by a builder. Okay. And the records, we'll talk about them in a moment, but they were in quite good condition. So this research project involved transitional justice people, architects, sociologists, ourselves as the financial people. So it really and truly is an interdisciplinary project trying to give views from multiple sources on what this laundry meant. Okay? Our brief as a financial operations have said and tried to provide an understanding of the operating model of the laundry and trying to assess whether or not it did work on a subsistence or close to break-even basis. So this was 2020. We were approached, and yes, we all know what happened. That's virus thingy. So it was late October, I think, 2020. 2 boxes of documents were passed to my colleague Ray Murphy. Thankfully, those documents were also digitized. Okay. So the restrictions continued. Lockdown, level 5 lockdown refers to the highest level of lockdown in the Republic at the time. So they continued for the whole duration of the research work. So we did not meet at all. It was a first for me, never met. I know my research partner Bree very well, worked with her in the past, but we never physically met. Okay, which is unusual. I like to talk to people. And you know, the documents, as I said, were digitized, but the whole research process essentially became digital. Okay. So what did we get? What records did we have? We had, these were all digitized, handwritten. They were handwritten, but they were digitized. From the 1960s to the 1980s. Some broken periods. So what did we have? We had cash receipts, customers, details of customers, expenditure, sales, tax or VAT details, price list, supplier invoice, and some more ad hoc correspondence. Okay? We didn't have any financial statements. Okay. What could we do with these things? Well, they're handwritten. We could not use digitalized text searches, but I'll come back to that point in a moment. So we would basically took a more manual approach, we call it, but we use spreadsheets. So basically input numbers, trying to compare inflows and outflows, and basically do a good old incomplete records exercise. And then we checked our figures to the VAT records, which were also given to us and digitized. Did those numbers tie up? So for anyone who's been in accounting practice, the sales for the accounts equal the sales for the VAT returns, and so on. So it gave us some way to check. Some background to the context of Magdalen Laundry or a charity. The particular laundry had the religious order had a charitable status since 1921, but there was no requirement to publish information until much more recently. But they were subject to canon law. They were required to render an account to a competent authority. Okay, now the competent authority, being a secular authority, didn't ask for anything at that point. But yet, canon law would have also asked them to account to the Church in Ireland and ultimately up to the Vatican. During the period, there was decimalisation, so that gave us some fun, going from pound, shillings, and pence to a decimal system. We also, had quite high inflation in the late 70s, early 80s. So we tried to get things back to current monetary value, just to show what the values were. That's all in the paper. From 1972 to prior to the Republic of Ireland joining the European Union, we had to introduce a VAT Act. All these things, the VAT Act, canon law, and the Consumer Price Index are all available digitally to us. And that really, really helps a lot. So in one quick look, I can check, well, what should they have done on the canon law? What did the VAT Act say about it? The VAT Act would have regarded and did regard laundry as trading, so therefore they were subject to VAT, even though generally charities are exempt from VAT. So we quickly can establish these facts, much quicker, I suppose, than you might have been able to do so in the past by having to look up a law, go to, I'm not sure where, a library of a theological university to find canon law, and so on. So it's a quicker, it's all digital and it's quicker. So as I said, we reconstructed the multiple years income statements, and we tried to assess what did our findings tell us. Our findings told us that more or less what was said before was true. The viability on a full commercial footing can probably be questioned, but they had no labour costs. The women in the laundries were never paid. It was viable to the religious order in that it contributed a surplus to that particular laundry location, to a head office, shall we say. So we more or less confirmed. But there were some statements in a couple of textbooks and articles about these Magdalen laundries, which we had to question them, so professional accountants and researchers. That doesn't feel right. And because you have digitalized laws and canon laws and everything, it's very quick to see what is happening. So, for example, there was a textbook that said these Magdalen laundries were never required to produce financial statements. Not fully true. They were required to produce financial statements for submission to the Vatican, ultimately. So, small game. You can say I'm being picky, but we need to be I suppose more precise sometimes. But we could check the canon laws. We can quote the sections very quickly because it's all available to us digitally. Look it up on the web. Okay? So, in terms of method, where are we getting to? Well, it's quicker, better, more reliable for us to have a digitalized process. Everything is available to us in this particular project in a digital format, and we can cross-check stuff quicker. So to reflect on the two projects, as I've just said, this access in digital gives us more access to whatever we want to find, I suppose, and cross-check the laws, more data. To me, it improves the triangulation because we can check sources very quickly. It allows us to do longitudinal analysis that we may not have been able to do before, particularly in the case of Guinness, for example. We can use tools and data sources that we may not have been able to do in the past. So we can, use the sentiment analysis. We can use Python if we wish to write our own code to check or sentiment or for word types or something, once we have this stuff in a digital format. Yeah, so that's the digitalization. The whole process becomes digital. It may allow us to help to avoid or diminish these criticisms, like, you know, scholasticism or sophism. So, you know, we question one or two things we read, which is normal in research. I grant that, but you know, it allows us to find answers quickly. There may, of course, be some problems, and this is something we probably need to develop a little bit more. Like records are not available, there's nothing we can do by that. Some archives, as you probably know, will just refuse to give you access to some material. Our own skill set, we may need to learn some new things. I don't know Python, I know a little bit about it, but I've seen what it can do and really, really analyze a lot of stuff. And if I may diverge into another paper myself and some colleagues done on an electricity company and the historic environmental reports it produced, we used some code in there to do an analysis, which basically verified our manual analysis of the text. So the method became much, much stronger by doing things in two ways. And we got some insights that we wouldn't have got manually. Some data may be less useful, for example, handwriting, but I'll come back to that in a moment. And, you know, the last time I presented this, we never heard of ChatGPT, AI that writes papers, weird things for us. What's next? We don't know. But until we appreciate digitalization, it's a process. We can't use those technologies. Digitizing doesn't necessarily do stuff. It just creates a series of zeros and ones in an electronic file. We need to be able to use that file for whatever and linking it to other pieces of software, data sources, and analysis as we see fit. In terms of the future, I think we need to think a little bit more digital. I think it may open up new avenues of research for us. I think the fact that digitization is happening and people are realizing that if I digitize material, it's preserved and accessible is very important. So I have a comment there with a range of archiving materials. I mean, they may increase. And who is CIE? CIE is an Irish state-owned company who basically run all public transport, railways, Dublin city buses and rural buses. And I've been doing so since 1950. Prior to 1950, they were various different companies. So, you know, the Dundalk and Vaughan Railway Company or the Great Northern, or whatever. And they have released all the annual reports that they have from the 1880s to today, just recently. I'm not going to tell you where they are because maybe I want to look. But they are publicly available. They're digitized. They're in PDF format. Early ones are handwritten. The later ones are typed. The same kind of analysis could be done. Same kind of projects might appear as gives. But transport may be interesting to economists, economic historians, and social historians. So they may be interdisciplinary research. So I think the more more archives get digitized, better. And there's lots and lots of archives being digitized now. I've been referring to methods we've done, you know, using the language software and so on. I think that's an obvious thing that we can do. We can also maybe do broader comparative studies because it's easier to compare digital data, digitized data. It's much easier. Interdisciplinary research, I've already said, for example, CIE could be, you know, economists, social historians, and so on. I think I really like the idea that history can contribute to contemporary context, contemporary theories, contemporary developments. And I think we can do that easier when we can digitalize our processes. Yeah. And then last but not least, I think we ourselves as accounting history researchers may become digital harvesters. Yeah? As in we may capture documents, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment. And just to finish on a quote, if I may, from Gregory 2014. The combination was 2014, almost 10 years ago. The combination of the computer's ability to manipulate and summarize large volumes of material and the human's brain's ability to interpret this property will provide major advances in our understanding of the past. It's 10 years ago. Technology has moved an awful lot since then. So a few times I've said I'm going to show you something later, and here's what I'm going to show you. It's just to give you an idea of what we can do. And this is, to me, really, really at the tip of the iceberg. So just give me a moment. So this was related to the Magdalen laundries. It's not the Donnybrook laundry. It's a limerick. And the reason why you're not seeing over to the left is because there are names of people there. I just don't want to show them lest they be accused of GDPR breaches or privacy. But basically, this relates to data from the 1940s, I think it was, 1947 to 52 or 53, which was found in a ledger, a cash book, essentially, in a pub in County Limerick. And one of the team involved in this interdisciplinary project I mentioned noticed this book and took a photograph of every page that they could with their phone camera. Okay, this is before COVID hit us, obviously. And you can just imagine this book. And every photograph was just a photograph, nothing else. Okay, just a JPEG. So COVID hits us. My daughter, who is now almost 19, was in a transition year at that time, and transition year did not happen for them. So transition years this year, there's no formal study in their secondary school, so they do all kinds of things like typically would have a business venture, those kinds of things, learn a new language and so on and so on. So there wasn't a whole lot to do during COVID. And one of the team on the book about Magdalen suggested to me that we need to digitize these, not digitize, we need to take these photographs and make something of them, not just photographs. So they're already digitized as a photograph, but we need to extract some information from them. So my daughter, to be good to her, volunteered to do that. And you may not know this, but if you open a JPEG in Google Docs will try to read the handwriting. So over to the left of this, every photograph she opened, she could copy and paste text that was there as, so each row was a cash receipt, a day, a name, an amount. So she could copy as much as was readable. And then she just had to fill out the gaps. So some manuals, and sometimes it worked really well, the handwriting was clean, and it was pretty good. I'd say 50-60% of the time it was accurate. Just by opening JPEG in Google Docs. And Google Docs does that if it tries to recognize any text in the photograph. And here's the fun part. So you can see a cell that's highlighted. And the address, let's say, it's 46 O'Connell Street, Limerick. And let's say the name was Martin Quinn. It's not. It's hidden over to the left, but let's say the name was Martin Quinn. Martin Quinn, 46 O'Connell Street, Limerick, received £10. Okay? Great. What can we do with that? Not a lot. It's just a list of cash receipts. But the names and the places might be of interest to somebody, to a social history researcher, to a geography person. So we just made a simple formula. Over to the left is the address line 1, address line 2. And then we just used the hyperlink formula in Excel to bring this to life, essentially. Create a link. Right-click on that link. Okay, of course it has to pop up on the other screen for me. I now see what that premises is today. It's some kind of a commercial premises. It's 46 O'Connell Street, Limerick, through Google Maps. Yeah, great, Martin, but to me, this is bringing the history to life. It's just a small little thing that we can do to, make our data useful, make it open to other interpretations, make it useful to others. And This can't be done. Process digitalized. It just cannot be done. A digitized photograph, great, it's a photograph. It needs to be taken to some other level, and everything needs to remain digital to allow us to see where 46 O'Connell Street currently is. Yeah. So, you know, to be fair, well, every dad loves his daughter, I guess. She came up with this formula herself through some web searching. What a great idea. And there's probably lots of other things we could do to make our data in some way accessible to other people, other researchers, other disciplines. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And again, apologies for not being there. It's now 8:10 on Monday night. So I hope you found this some way interesting. And if there are any questions, I'm sure somebody there can maybe forward them to me. And you know, this paper hopefully gets accepted at some point. It's just to try to get the ideas out there. I'm not prescribing how anything should be done. I'm not criticizing past research. I'm just trying to open up the debate about what we can do with technology through digitalization of our accounting history research. I hope this has given you some ideas to work on. So I'll stop talking now. Thank you. Bye.
Well, that was interesting, I thought. If anyone wants to talk about what Martin just talked about, then feel free to jump in. Absolutely, anyone would like to say something? Richard, what would you like to say?
I didn't, yeah, maybe Karen is going to pass these questions on, but I didn't quite understand the argument that the laundry was sustainable because it didn't have any labour costs. But these women were being given board and lodging, weren't they, by the nuns? It's just that they hadn't allocated that cost to the laundry. But you couldn't run a laundry without paying people, normal people, as it were. So, in fact, it wasn't sustainable. Anyway, that's a question. On Guinness, Guinness is now part of Diageo, isn't it? But most FTSE 100 companies, at least, give you an Excel version of their annual report, so that analysts can work on them and do different projections and what ifs and whatever. So they are digitalized and can be searched. And if we've got time, I can tell you a story about Guinness.
Yeah, go ahead then, Richard.
When I was at Aberystwyth, we used to take the students to Dublin each year for an outing. And that would include going to Dublin City University, where one of the professors was on the Accounting Standards Board and would give us a talk, and going to Guinness Brewery to see the processes and how it all worked. And I asked a partner in one, I better not say which firm, one of the big four firms in Wales, could we have a grant, to subsidise the student trip? And he said, well, where are you going? I said, well, we're going to the Guinness Brewery to see how it all... He said, come on, Richard, this is just a student piss-up, isn't it? And I said, well. He said, in that case, the firm would be delighted to give them a subsidy. So I obviously thought that was good soft power to attract students to join whichever of the big four firms it was. So there are, there's lots of side benefits to doing research. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. All right. Anyone else like to say anything? Looking around. Oh, Karen, yeah, go ahead.
I guess I was only going to make an observation about something that worries me slightly about the sort of mass production, if you like, of digitization and being able to analyze it using Python and other quantitative methods. Whilst per se I don't have anything against that, it just worries me sometimes that we might end up the same as other parts of accounting, where we are regressing this against that and deciding that this is the situation, rather than in accounting history, we're very, very good at seeing context, backgrounds and stories. It worries me slightly that this makes it more, as I said, I've got nothing against digitization per se, but it just worries me we might go the quants route and regress lots of things.
Isn't that the digitalization of, rather than the digitization that you're talking about?
I have no idea, Greg. I'm too dyslexic to know the difference between the two. So,
I'll be honest, I look at the words on the page and I can't see the difference. But the analyzation is about the process of analysing and using the data, as well as just creating the data in digital form. That's what the link that Alan's suggested we should look at. And I was having a private conversation with Alan too, where Alan was saying that microfiche are digital, but which they're not, they're optical. So they're not digital, but and he referred me to the same site, which says nothing about whether they're digital or not. But anyway, so
if you look at economic history more generally, I mean, loads of it is quantitative economic history these days. So we're behind the curve rather than ahead of it. And they have the context as well. They do.
Then it's more, it seems more acceptable somehow.